Okay, well, I was just real interested when I read your book about growing up in, what was it, Glen Innes, that you talked about the fact that it was just kind of a wonderful childhood, great little town to grow up in, but there was kind of a hidden secret, and that you didn't even basically know what an Aboriginal person was until you were quite a bit older and went off and read it in a book somewhere. So tell me a little bit about the wonderful people there that raised you and your teachers and people in the community, but then there was this, kind of story that was never told.
In Kalokerinos, as children, we were perfectly safe.
Okay. Let me stop you for a second. Did you turn on that mic there, Pamela?
No.
Yeah, let's see. Okay, now we're okay. Okay.
In Kalokerinos, as children, we were absolutely safe. We could go anywhere, day or night, not be worried about anything. People cared. They protected children. They protected each other. There was only one sergeant of police and one constable for the entire area. I don't think he ever had much work to do. Nowadays, you can hardly even walk around the block without some element of fear. And we're absolutely safe with any of the men, and women for that matter, that we needed to be associated with. Be it our teachers at school, we could go anywhere with them. With the cub master and the scout masters. We belonged to a juvenile lodge. There's never even a hint of any problem anywhere. And if anyone was in trouble, the whole town rallied around them to help. What we weren't told, however, was a fact that perhaps less than 150, well, certainly less than 150 years before, this whole area belonged to the Aborigines. We were not told that every single trace of the Aborigines had been wiped off the face of the earth forever and ever. There wasn't even a boomerang, remains of a spear, absolutely nothing to remind us at once that was Aboriginal land. The pioneers built 3 fine churches, Church of England, Roman Catholic Church and the Presbyterian Church. It's hardly an exaggeration to say that they went to church on Sunday morning and went blackberrying Sunday afternoon, which meant that they went and slaughtered Aborigines. And I find that quite extraordinary. We were not even taught at school about the real history of Australia. It wasn't until my senior school years, when we moved to Sydney and the school had a substantial library, that I read books by the famous author Ian Idris, which detailed accurately what Australia used to be like and the history of some of the Aboriginal people. Now, I find that strange. The good citizens of Glen Innes provided soldiers for the Boer War, the First War and the Second War. They lost a lot of very fine young men. And I think a large part of the reason why they went to war was not just because of patriotism, but because they sincerely believed that the world would be a better place. And yet their grandparents and great-grandparents were guilty of genocide. And to me that's a very important thing, really. People can change, and do change. But it meant that my education was really rather lopsided. And I missed out on a great deal, really. And I was fortunate that a few authors at least had documented some of the things that went on.
Can you talk about how that same sort of feeling, and I would call it racism, that prompted genocide amongst those people and no history left of the Aboriginal people, how did that affect the work that you were doing? And I mean, just do you think that there was an undercurrent of, well, I'll be frank, an undercurrent of their Aborigines let them die?
Yes, there were many massacres right across Australia. Most of them deliberately never documented. I met Aborigines in Central Australia who survived massacres that occurred after the Second War. That's not long ago. When I first went to Central Australia in 1965, authorities were still rounding up Aboriginal children, sometimes, or mostly as a matter of fact, without telling the parents. If they were with the parents, they would forcibly take them away and take them away sometimes 1,000 or 2,000 miles. And they would be placed into homes. Then when they got a little bit older, the girls would be placed into positions where they were virtually housemaids. The men were virtually slave labour. Why that was done is difficult to explain. I think that the authorities sincerely believed that it was better for the Aborigines to take them away from their communities and turn them into white people. And they call these children that were taken away the stolen generations. Some of them were treated very badly. Indeed, many of them. Everything from physical abuse to sexual abuse. And the man who produced the film about my life work a couple of years ago produced a magnificent film about 3 Aboriginal children who were taken away, I think 1,000 miles or so, I can't remember the distance, and placed in custody. And they ran away. And the older of the girls, who was still probably just a teenager, maybe not even a teenager, it worked out that if she followed a fence which was built from the north to the south of Australia to keep rabbits out of one area, it was a continuous fence, she knew that she would get home. So these 3 children followed that fence all the way home. But when they got home, they were taken away again. So they repeated the performance. It's a very moving story. But it was a very cruel thing to do. Massacres, just awful. Not far from where we lived for a long time, in the town of Bingara, where I practiced for 10 years, just a few miles up the road, there was the infamous Mile Creek. And a group of white men rode long distances, killing Aborigines as they went. But they missed the group at Mile Creek, and they continued on up into the hills, and someone told them about the Mile Blacks. So they turned back. They lured the men away, the fit men, telling them that they wanted them to collect bark for the tanning of hides. And they rode into the Aboriginal camp. They shot a few men that were still there, then tied all the women and children together, the ropes around their necks, and one by one pulled them into the stockyards, the cattle yards. They slashed the women to death with cutlasses, because bullets are too expensive. They bashed the kids' brains out against trees. That was the infamous Mile Creek Massacre. But for the first time in the history of Australia, those responsible for the massacre were arrested. And 6 of them were eventually hanged. But mostly, those responsible for massacres got off scot-free. A lot of these white people thought that the only good place to live in was one that was totally free from Aborigines. But of course I know that this went on in other countries too. But it's hard to imagine why they found it was necessary to do that.
How did your relationship with the Aboriginals, how is it different than that?
Well, at first it was compassion to see these little kids dying. And no explained reason, and no one to help me. And in those days, whenever a child died, there would be wailing in the camp. The women would wail loudly for hours. They would wail loudly during the funerals, and I could hear the wailing from my bedroom. I felt a natural compassion, which was only human. I don't think that I can claim to be very different to anybody else really. But I actually had to place my hands on them. There's a degree of racism too. There are several veterans of the First War there who were Aborigines who fought in France. They were not allowed to go into the Returned Servicemen's Club, even on Anzac Day. They were excluded. The Aborigines, when they went to the open-air picture theatre at Kalokerinos, had to be seated right at the back of the theatre in a separate area. They weren't allowed to sit amongst the white people. They were not allowed to go into the hotel and drink beer. But some of the leading citizens of the area used to illegally supply them with alcohol in return for money. And that made me very, very angry indeed, because the Aborigines would get drunk and the police would raid the camp and arrest anyone, drunk or sober as a matter of fact, throw them into the paddy wagon and then into the cells. And I complained about this because I told the sergeant that for every Aborigine who is arrested for being drunk, then a white supplier of alcohol should also be arrested. But I was told that they couldn't do that because they could never get a witness. Well, one morning, at 8:30 in the morning, I saw a white man sell alcohol to an Aborigine man just a few yards away from a group of Aboriginal school kids. And I was absolutely furious. So I went round to the sergeant and I said, "You've got your witness." He didn't act. But at the time, the police were paid extra according to the number of prisoners they had in the cells. They were paid as lock-up keepers. So they used to keep the cells full of Aborigines. And they would raid the camp and arrest anyone drunk or sober, throw them into the cells. One evening they pulled a particular man out of bed, and he was a teetotaler. He never drank. Threw him into the cell, and he complained that he wasn't well, and they ignored him. And an hour or two later found him dead. Now I was called around to see him, because I was the only doctor in the area. I did an autopsy on him, and he'd had a coronary occlusion. So I wrote out my report. I was pulled out of bed in the early hours of the morning by the inspector of police who'd driven 100 miles from where he was based to try to sort this out. He sat opposite me and he said, "Dr. Kalokerinos, on reconsidering it, don't you think that there was alcohol in this man's stomach?" I said there wasn't. He said, "I am asking you to change your evidence and state that there was." I got very angry. I refused. He said, "You know, Dr. Kalokerinos, we can make life pretty hard for you around here." And I got so angry I actually picked him up and threw him out physically. And that little act of mercy has followed me ever since. And I could sense the hostility in every policeman who ever came to that area. One day I was driving slowly up the main street and I saw an Aboriginal man walking up the street, and two white men came out of the hotel and followed him. And I heard they were brothers. I heard one of them say to the other, "Finish him off." So they ran up behind this Aboriginal man and King hit him. He dropped. By the time I stopped the car and ran across the road, he was dead. I did the autopsy on him. He had a broken neck, blood going up into his brain. I wrote out the report. I was the only doctor there, of course. I attended the inquest, provided the statement. No one was tried. To make matters worse, the man who King hit him was a trained boxer. And if a trained boxer hits a man in a brawl and kills him, it's not manslaughter, it is murder. He wasn't even tried. I protested, of course, but all I did was to get myself into further trouble. So that really was part of the racist situation that existed in those early days.
So, do you think that affected your work when you started telling the bureaucracy there in Australia to give these children vitamin C? Do you think that their reluctance to do so was racism?
I think that played a role. I find the psychology hard to figure. They were jealous. They were jealous of my achievements. They were jealous of my reputation. They were jealous of the name that I made for myself. I think that was certainly an issue. But why did the Germans kill so many Jews during the war? I mean, it's a very complex issue. Whatever the mechanisms that are involved, I can't speak with authority about them, but I think that fundamentally there's a great similarity between what some of the Germans did to the Jews and what we did to some of the Aborigines. But of course, a lot of white men, elite white men, didn't hesitate when their blood started to get a bit hot to have relationships with a young Aboriginal woman, which meant that the babies that were born were half-castes, using that expression, which is an awful expression, but for want of a clearer word. And that was a bit of an embarrassment to them. And that is partly why they invented this system of taking half-caste children away from the mothers, because it was embarrassing to have white children on one side of the fence and half-caste children on the other side of the fence. But the worst thing was not so much the attitude of the authorities and people in general, but was the attitude of my colleagues. And some of these doctors were obviously intelligent men. I knew some of them very well, and they always beat me in exams at the university. But when it came to Aboriginal illnesses, particularly infant illnesses, they had two problems. They refused to admit that certain terrible, terrible problems existed, such as a high infant death rate, a high incidence of sore ears, and so on. And they refused to look at the real reason why I was able to achieve this dramatic drop in infant mortality rates. Now, I went to towns, for example, where when I was investigating the problem of otitis media, and the very first place I went to, there were two doctors, reasonable looking men. I asked them, have you got any problems here with Aboriginal children and sore ears? No, we don't have any problem. Like hell. We didn't find a single Aboriginal child with normal hearing. There's an average of one perforated eardrum per child. It's very difficult. I'll give you another example. A 15-year-old Aboriginal girl in a neighbouring town had a premature baby. There are about half a dozen organisations in the town, mostly government organisations, that were supposed to be there to handle welfare. But this girl upset them all. Says she was provided with nothing. She took the baby home to the dirt floor shed that was perched on the riverbank. And it's little wonder it was winter time that the baby got sick. And one night she carried the baby wrapped in a filthy shawl to the doctor. He did not examine that baby. He didn't take a case history, except he heard that the baby had diarrhoea. Had he unwrapped the filthy shawl, he would have seen a baby that was very similar to a Belsen victim. Grossly underweight, dehydrated. He wrote out a prescription for an antibiotic and an anti-diarrhea mixture, which is dangerous. The mother carried the baby home. He died a few minutes later. I was called to do the autopsy. I've got photographs of that baby that I don't like to show. A wizened little thing. Now, that doctor was never questioned. Nothing was done. And that, I'm sorry to say, is fairly typical. So, I must say that life became very, very difficult for me and very stressful indeed. The authorities, instead of investigating the problems in a proper way, became extremely hostile.
Now we'll get on to a little bit more fun subject, because it seems like you and Glenn, what was his last name?
Dittman?
Dittman? Had a pretty good partnership or relationship. So what can you tell us about Glenn?
Well, Glenn was one of the leaders of a medical organisation that consisted of a great variety of medical skills. They weren't all specialists, for example, in ear, nose and throat, or just specialists in diseases of the big right toe. And there's a lot of skills amongst them. And the idea was that they should combine together to investigate medical problems. And they first looked at the overuse of antibiotics, but it was such a complex issue that they couldn't find a way around it. And then they heard about me, so they sent Glenn Detman up to Kalokerinos with a team. And the idea was really not to investigate what I did, but to demonstrate to me that I was wrong. But they were open-minded enough to realise that I was right. And Glenn in particular became a very strong convert and a great helper, indeed. For example, Glenn actually was married twice. He was married first to his wife Nancy, and his second marriage was to his beloved Nikon microscope. And he decided that he would make a second visit to Kalokerinos and medically investigate what I was doing. So he brought his microscope with him and all the other gear that was necessary. The first thing he wanted to do was to examine feces, bowel motions of these children. So we sent the message around the Aboriginal community and the white community that we needed samples of feces. Well, we got samples of feces in beer bottles and buckets, and we got it in. Believe it or not, there's one sample in a perfume bottle. How in the hell they managed to squeeze it through that tiny hole on the top of a perfume bottle, I wouldn't know. But I still remember how Glenn prepared the first slide, because I told him that he was wasting his time looking for parasites because I'd sent specimens over the years down to the government laboratories and all the reports were negative. He said, well, we'll find out. Prepared the first slide, he put under the microscope, he went like that, he said, have a look. And it was loaded. That was an important issue, very important issue. He did all sorts of tests, and the more he investigated, the more convinced he became that I was right. He was a very valuable accessory, if I could use that word, to say the least. He insisted on carting me around the world to see various people that would help. He reviewed the literature intensely, which was not easy in those days without computers. He made sure that we met with and talked with people who had various skills and various knowledge and so on. And I think without him, we would, well, there's no doubt about it, we would never have made much progress.
Tell us about your relationship with, could I get a glass of water when you come back? Tell us about your relationship with, or what connection you had with Linus Pauling.
Well, I didn't know about Linus Pauling initially. I didn't do a specialist course in chemistry at school, or at the university either. And I went up to Brisbane to speak to a particular research worker who later became a professor about vitamin C. And he said, well, had you come to speak to me about this a year or so ago, I would not have believed a word of what you said. He said, but there's this bloke called Professor Linus Pauling, who's the most brilliant chemist the world has ever seen. And he's talking about vitamin C. And the fact that he is talking about vitamin C means that we should at least consider it. So we came to America and we met Linus Pauling. That's another great event in my life. Linus Pauling was a man with incredible skills, and he had his heart in the right place. The reason why he became interested in vitamin C is rather important. On one occasion he gave a lecture, I think it was in New York, about recent advances in biochemistry. And he stated during that lecture that he's so excited by these advances he'd like to live to be 100 to see them come through. And after the lecture, one of the audience, a biochemist by the name of Erwin Stone, wrote to him. He said something like this: Professor Pauling, I can tell you how you can live to be 100. You take vitamin C. So Pauling reasoned with his knowledge that there was something to it. So he and Dr. Stone formed unofficially a club which became known as the 100 Club. People who take vitamin C are going to live to be 100. But of course, if you die before you get to the age of 100, you're automatically expelled. He got very close to that age. But his knowledge of the structure of the atom and the nature of the chemical bond was enormously useful because it explained a lot about the way that vitamin C worked. He also knew a lot about the atom bomb. He worked with Einstein, who was a friend of his, on the nature of the chemical bond. And that's why he became opposed to the atom bomb. He spoke out against it. He knew what harm it would do. So he was labelled as a communist. He wasn't, of course. And at one stage he was about to go to Cambridge in England to see those famous X-ray diffraction photographs that were shown to Watson and Crick. But at the airport they took his passport from him and he couldn't travel. He was within a cat's whisker of discovering the double helix. But at that stage he thought it was a triple helix. So Watson and Crick were shown those photographs and they took one look at them and they knew that it was a double helix. But they had one problem. To prove it was a double helix, they had to know the sequence of the amino acids in the structure. There's only one man who knew anything about that. Linus Pauling had discovered it all and had published it in a book. So they hunted around Cambridge and they found one copy of his book. They took one look at it and they knew beyond any doubt that it was a double helix. But in actual fact, in retrospect, it's not just a double helix. It can be a triple helix. It can be all sorts of other funny shapes too. So Linus Pauling was not all that far away from it. But neither Pauling or the girl who took those famous photographs ever got due credit. To me, Pauling was almost like a father. He would do anything for me, almost. And he wrote the foreword for one of my books. I spent a whole day with him not long before he died. And he showed me the important work that he'd done, tried to explain it. I found it difficult to understand. But how he ever figured out all that, I wouldn't know. The big lesson that he taught me, though, was to think. He said that his major discoveries were found simply because he thought a lot. He'd go to bed thinking. And this is what I learned to do. And by doing that, I was able to find answers or partial answers to some really difficult problems. Pauling, in a way, was a god. And I mention that word God because some problems that I've struggled with for years and years have eluded me as far as getting an answer for. But then suddenly, bang, like that, I get an answer or a partial answer. Yesterday I was looking at a magazine here that Sandy had. And there's a long article in it about fat cells. Now, a lot of the infants that died under my care and had examinations under the microscope of their livers demonstrated an abnormality called steatosis, which means fatty changes in the liver. But the authorities assured me it was nothing to worry about and couldn't possibly cause death. But I thought it was strange that I only found it in these babies and not in normal people. When I tried to ask questions about it, everyone became hostile. Well, it turns out it's a very important marker, according to the article I read in this magazine yesterday.